We already looked at Federalist 47. We're going to look at Federalist 48 today. Look at Federalist 47 through Federalist 51 as an extended, very important argument by Madison. The argument is the separation of powers is needed so that your government, those who are in charge, won't become tyrants. That is, they will enforce their laws on you any way they want to. And the argument is also that with separation of powers, you will have rule of law. Law that will be applied to you and I, to rich and poor, to the lawmaker's family, and us equally and fairly. In other words, the person who is going to make the law or make the laws, they will be treated the same way under that law, whether they are in office or whether they are out of office, the same as you and I and every other citizen in the country. Madison, Hamilton, and Jay, they were not totally distrustful of all human beings, but they were distrustful and realistic enough that they knew if you give power to anyone, that person, even though he could be a good person, they could be corrupted by power. So one of the safeguards for this is always have the written law where people know what the law is. Because they took some of this idea from John Locke that the law, when we want the rule of law, has to be declared law. He used to call it declared law. It's got to be that it's known. It's not vague. So that everybody knows what to do, what not to do, when not to cross the line and do something illegal. So Madison, Hamilton, and Jay, as Publius, they knew that power corrupts. Because of that, we'll have to separate powers within the different departments of government. And while you separate the power, separation of powers, another thing becomes important. You keep it separate for 2 months, 3 months, 6 months. Of course, they wanted it to extend as long as the government is working. So what do you do to make sure this balance doesn't get messed up? You have the idea of checks and balances. In Federalist 47, Madison said, our critics say that the powers are separated, but they are not totally separated like Montesquieu has said, the political philosopher Montesquieu, whom they looked up to quite a bit. But Madison says, no, if we want separation of powers to last forever, you have to give a bit of agency to each department to check other departments. In other words, not to let them encroach upon its rights and gradually violate everything that the Constitution stands for. So, and he calls it a little bit of partial agency. In other words, every department, every branch of the government has got to have a little bit of say in what the other branches are doing. Otherwise, that total separation of powers becomes a joke. It won't work. And another important thing that he says is, especially in Federalist 48, is that in a monarchy or in a direct democracy, whoever whom you have given the executive authority to, that person might become a tyrant. However, in the way that we frame the government, as we have seen it in the state governments right now, in 1787, he says, the way we frame the government, the tendency is that the legislative branch has a tendency towards tyranny, because they feel like, because they're closer to people elect them, they can just do anything and get away with it. And we are not watchful. That would be the problem. That's where the balance of power tilts towards the legislative, and then you won't have rule of law. So he says we have to be really, really careful about how we set the system up so that the legislative department will not have the overwhelming power and abuse and violate the rights of other branches and totally make the system into an unbalanced and unfair system. So remember, we said separation of powers, rule of law, and when we get to Federalist 51, Madison says what we're looking at, what we are trying to check, to stop, is ambition. It says ambition must counteract ambition. In other words, any person with power, any group of people with power can become ambitious in a wrong way, not the way we use the word today, but in the way it was used back then, and can violate other people's rights. So he's being very realistic. He says that's what we have to target. People become ambitious when they're given power, even if they're good people, especially when they're in groups. We have to frame this government in a way to stop that from destroying people's liberty. So let me read a little bit of this paper. It was shown in the last paper that the political apothegm there examined does not require that the legislative, executive, and judiciary departments should be wholly unconnected with each other. I shall undertake in the next place to show that unless these departments be so far connected and blended as to give to each a constitutional control over the others, the degree of separation which the maxim requires as essential to a free government can never in practice be duly maintained. So you have to have some partial agency, a little bit of control by each branch on other branches. We'll continue with this in the next video.